Meanwhile, President Biden will deliver a farewell address to the nation tonight from the Oval Office, scheduled for 8 p.m. Eastern. According to sources, Biden is expected to reflect on his decades of service to the country and will include a message to Americans about the country's future. As President Biden prepares to bid farewell to the White House, a new opinion piece in the Financial Times is describing his final curtain call as, quote, tragic. U.S. national editor for the Times, Ed Luce, contends the 46th president will be, quote, remembered chiefly for easing Trump's return. And Ed joins us now with more on this.
Ed, thank you so much. Some light reading from you this morning in the Financial Times. You say that Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump, stood up to Russia, enacted more reforms than Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and bequeaths a robust economy. That made Biden a hero to America's left and beyond. Yet most of his achievements will now be erased. His legacy is Trump's return. After Biden, the deluge. He largely has himself to blame. The Greek tragic hero's defect is hubris, but it is the flawed hero's nobility that gives Biden a Greek ending. Virtue and hubris were both present in his personal tragedies. Explain, Ed.
The Greek tragedy is, of course, the hero is brings his own downfall, is a flawed hero, and Biden was undoubtedly a very good president until he wasn't. And where I think he wasn't was in failing to step down. We had a number of journalists, but not enough. David Ignatius most prominently blowing the whistle on Biden's waning powers and on the fact that public opinion was indicating 2 years before the 2024 election that it was skeptical of whether he could serve another term. David Ignatius blew the whistle on that. Ezra Klein did. They were very much sort of censored and ostracized for saying what everybody in this town knew. Which was that Biden was being shielded from unscripted encounters with the public, with the media, and was having a shorter and shorter day as president. In other words, that he wasn't fit to run again in 2024. And that didn't come through till the debate last June. It really left it too late for an open primary. It made it very difficult for Kamala Harris to launch a credible winning campaign against Donald Trump. And I think that, therefore, history, being brutal, is going to remember Biden not just as a bridge away from Trump in 2020, but as a bridge back to Trump in 2024. That's the tragedy of this. He was and has been a very good president. But history will remember him chiefly for being the bridge back to Trump. And I take absolutely no pleasure in saying that.
Let me press you on a few things here, Ed. You said that David Ignatius said something that everybody in Washington knew. I must say, there are many of us who know Joe Biden fairly well. I'm sitting next to one of them. I'm sure Mike Barnicle will have a question for you as well. Mike Barnicle, his chief complaints early on, quietly to me and others, was that they were not letting Joe Biden out enough. Mike talks to President Biden and has regularly throughout the year. I spent, as I've said before, 2.5, 3 hours with Joe Biden in the White House, all over the White House, talking at length and in depth about foreign policy matters. And he was as sharp as anybody else I've spoken to, and spoke actually like a man who's been doing this since he was 29 years old and knew world leaders. Was he slower physically? Yes. Did he occasionally jumble a few words or a few names? Yes. But he corrected those as well. So after 2.5, 3 hours of it with him in the White House, going all over the White House, I did not see that. I spoke with French leaders after they had some pretty tough negotiations with him a couple of years ago. They left that meeting surprised how sharp he was and how They had listened to press reports saying that he had lost 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. They were surprised by the fact that actually he was pressing Macron on every single issue. I've spoken to leaders in the Middle East. I mean, I could go on and on about this. I heard also at the same time that he would be at fundraisers at night. And he would be wandering in his statements, even reading from a teleprompter. I don't know that it's quite so easy that everybody in Washington, D.C. thought the man was ill-equipped to be president of the United States. I know that's what they say on social media, but that certainly wasn't my experience. I would guess Mike Barnicle will tell you the same thing as well as Mika.
Maybe, but I mean, foreign leaders and foreign governments told me very different things to what you've just said. I think that people, who are getting older and have waning energy and vitality can go in and out. They can have strong moments, they can have weak moments. I think, though, that the key thing here was that the debate last June occurred several days after Biden had been traveling and wasn't considered to be shocking by a lot of the people I know, in various circles around the White House, that was the performance that reflected Biden's mental powers at the time. So I think the American public had it right.
I'm sorry. Wait. I've got to interrupt you again. And again, Ed, you and I are very good friends. I've got to stop you right there. I've had in-depth conversations with people in the White House before, during, and after who are still trying to figure out what happened that night. I just over the past, I think I said on the air, Jeff Zients said that he still will go out and his friends will be saying, why didn't you tell us? You think we knew that was going to happen? There's still people that are trying to figure out, and I said this to Susan Page a couple weeks ago, what exactly happened that night? Because anybody that's telling you that that is a reflection of how Joe Biden was operating inside of the White House regularly, that's something radically different than people that worked closest with him and people that I know that were around him for large parts of the day were saying.
Ed.
Yeah, Joe, I'm not actually making stuff up here. I talk to people who know Biden as well, and I can assure you, I have many conversations over the previous couple of years about his declining energy, his declining memory, his increasingly short daily schedule to accommodate his declining memory and energy. So, I'm not putting this out of thin air. We're
not saying that. And as Mika said, two things can be true at once. I'm never in a million years would suggest you're making anything up. I'm saying in retrospect, things certainly look clearer on the other side of it for people that are talking to you. I guess the question is, why didn't they talk 6 months ago? Why didn't they talk a year ago? If that's what they saw, why didn't they say it? Because if I had seen it, I would have said it. You're right, though. Couple of notables. David Ignatius did come out very early and say that Joe Biden should step down. He was one of the few. The Wall Street Journal had a story over the summer suggesting that Joe Biden was not strong mentally. Of course, the weakness of that article is they quoted Kevin McCarthy citing a meeting where he had walked out and told reporters that Joe Biden was the Albert Einstein of our time, basically, and he was looking forward to talking to Biden every day. Biden was running the show, blah, 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 blah. So, again, it certainly, I guess my question is, if that is the case, why weren't people saying things earlier?
Well, I mean, I reread David's piece actually the other day. He made it very plain. I think set out the right argument September 23, and I don't think David was sort of uniquely accessed at that point. Certainly, the conversations I have with people in our profession. But also people working in and around the White House, there were very similar conclusions being drawn. And that was, 15 months before the election. There was time then for Biden to cede the field and have a full open primary for the Democratic Party. I think in terms of your conversation last week with Susan Page, where the interview that President Biden, the exit interview he gave to USA Today, he said he thought he could have won anyway. I think that's highly contestable. I think you see the difference between the numbers that Kamala Harris got. She came within a point and a half of Trump's number, and the numbers that the polls were very consistently showing Biden at, which was far lower than that. I think that's an understandable sense of sort of pride in the fact that he defeated Trump in 2020 and that he was, as I wish to emphasize, a very good president, that he thought he could beat Trump in November. But I do think that's completely wrong. I think there is no basis for him to believe that.
And of course,
because the polls have always been so great.
Well, I was saying that he saw what happened in the midterms, and he thought he still had a shot. I'm sure that's what was happening. But I will say, Mike, even before the debate, we were commenting that Joe Biden was losing ground in Minnesota, in New Hampshire, in Virginia. The polls were going in a terrible direction for him even before that disaster of a debate. So the idea that he could have won, I know Mika believes he still could have won. The numbers certainly at the time did not suggest that.
No, and you can't. I don't think you can talk President Biden out of his belief that he could have won. I mean, but that's the way he is. That's the business he's in. And Ed, I don't think anyone would quibble with what you wrote today in your assessment of the Biden presidency. But that's today. It's a snapshot. It's not history. Don't you think that history's view of Joe Biden is going to be a little bit different than your view of Joe Biden in today's piece that you've written, in the sense that it's going to take into account Joe Biden's role in keeping NATO together, in keeping Ukraine alive, in the day-to-day tug-of-war match that he's had with Bibi Netanyahu for a year and a half, and most importantly, the economic underpinnings of legislation that he passed on a bipartisan basis in the first 18 months of his presidency that are going to transform many middle-class cities and towns in this country over a longer period of time. Not today, not yet, but within 2 or 3 years, AI and all of the chip manufacturing that's going to happen in this country is going to transform and help a lot of American families.
That's a very good question, Mike, and I hope that you're right. A lot, of course, depends on how much of this Trump tries to reverse and repeal and abolish in Congress. I think if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, there's tons of investment there that has gone to red districts. The investment that Republicans in those districts voted against at the time but claim credit for now and would be, I think, loath to see abolished because they've created jobs in their districts. I think the CHIPS Act, which is trying to reshore semiconductor investment to America, might survive. And I think the infrastructure bill, although most of it hasn't really been implemented, might survive too. But on Ukraine, I'm a little bit less sanguine. I think Biden did an excellent job of supporting Zelensky, expanding NATO, restoring morale to the Western alliance. But if you ask anybody in Europe now, or indeed in Washington, D.C., they think that era is over. That the advantage is shifting to Putin. And therefore, those gains under Biden look like they might be very, very fragile right now, if not, headed for the ash heap. So a lot depends, in answer to your question, Mike, on how much of it Trump reverses, and indeed whether Trump himself is succeeded by a Trumpian in 2028, or whether the Democratic Party can rebound and become competitive again.
Yeah, Democrats need to figure that out in a big way. U.S. national editor for the Financial Times, Ed Luce, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. We love you.
Much. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you.